Hello everyone, I'm the Dark Teller. Tonight prepare yourself for an unforgettable experience filled with spine-chilling scary stories. Each tale is designed to evoke fear and suspense, perfectly paired with the calming sound of rain to help you relax before you drift off to sleep. Share your location and the time you're watching in the comments. If these chilling stories leave you shivering, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Settle in, embrace the fright, and let the scary stories take you on a thrilling journey. I never imagined the town of Ridgewell could become the backdrop to something I still hesitate to explain. Nestled in a quiet valley, Ridgewell was a sleepy place with no more than a few thousand residents. The type of town where the air smelled faintly of pine, and the roads were lined with creaky wooden houses whose paint had long begun to flake. It was where I grew up, where I felt safest, and where I returned one early November after 5 years working in the city. The catalyst for everything came in the form of an old, handwritten map I found in my late grandfather's study. He was an avid historian, obsessed with local lore and peculiar tales. While sorting through his possessions, I stumbled upon the map folded neatly within a leather-bound notebook. Scrawled in his hasty script, it read, "Path to the Lost Hour." I chuckled, half dismissing it as one of his fanciful ideas. But the words haunted me, like a whisper at the edge of a dream. Curiosity gnawed at me, especially when I noticed the map led through the woods just behind his house. I spent countless childhood afternoons exploring those woods, but this path seemed unfamiliar. With the map in hand and a flashlight tucked into my coat pocket, I set out at dusk. The sky was tinged a deep orange, the kind that melted into purple as night approached. The path was narrower than I remembered. Leaves crunched beneath my boots, their sound sharper than usual, almost echoing. I followed the map closely, eyes flicking between the yellowing paper and the tangled thicket ahead. Occasionally, I noticed markings on the trees, small, almost imperceptible carvings of circles and arrows that matched those drawn on the map. It felt like a scavenger hunt, playful at first, but then the air began to change. I can't explain it, but suddenly everything became muffled. The sound of my footsteps dulled as if the forest were swallowing them. The wind died, and an unnatural stillness draped over the trees. I stopped, shining my flashlight around. The beam caught on something that glimmered briefly, a shard of glass embedded in the bark of an oak. Leaning closer, I noticed it was a broken watch face, its hands frozen at 9:14. A chill danced up my spine. Why would someone embed a watch here? I thought, my eyes darting around for clues. A distant rustling made me jump and I spun around, but the path behind me was empty, just the dense dark pressing closer. I told myself it was just a deer, or perhaps a raccoon disturbed by my presence. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was observing me. I pressed on, the forest narrowing and twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The trees seemed to age the farther I went. Some had gnarled roots that curled above ground like the limbs of an old sentinel. I glanced down at the map, and that's when I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The ink on the map was different, fresher, the handwriting more deliberate. It was as if someone had just marked it. Before I could think too deeply, a light appeared ahead. It was dim, flickering, like a lantern swaying in the wind. My rational mind told me to turn around, but my legs carried me forward, slow and steady. The light revealed a clearing, and in the center stood an old wooden cabin. I knew every inch of this forest, and there had never been a structure here. The cabin looked ancient, the wood dark with age, yet there was no decay, no overgrowth claiming its sides. A voice inside me urged caution, but the intrigue won. I knocked on the door lightly, half expecting it to crumble under my touch. Instead, it creaked open with a sound so low and mournful it made my breath catch. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick with a scent I couldn't place, smoke mixed with something metallic. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. The lantern on the wooden table flickered again, its flame dancing as if caught in an unseen breeze. And then I noticed them. Objects scattered around the room, small items you wouldn't think twice about. An old pocket watch, a shoe polished to a mirror shine, a child's doll with one glass eye missing. Each item seemed out of place, mismatched, yet significant. The floorboards groaned behind me and I spun around, but saw nothing. I was alone. The silence felt oppressive, almost vibrating in my ears. I needed to leave. Just as I turned to step outside, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a cracked mirror on the wall. But it wasn't quite my reflection. It was me, but not me. The man staring back had eyes that seemed older, wearier, and a thin streak of white ran through his dark hair. A low whisper brushed past my ear. Time is a circle. I whipped around, and this time I saw it. A figure half in shadow watching me from the corner. Its face was obscured, but I could see enough to tell it was wearing an old coat like those in the photographs my grandfather collected. My throat tightened, and before I could scream or move, the lantern went out, plunging the room into darkness. I bolted for the door, my heart racing, and as soon as I stepped outside, the sound of the forest returned all at once. The rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind. I glanced back, but the cabin was gone. Just trees stood where it had been, their branches swaying gently as if nothing had happened. I stumbled back home, my flashlight flickering out just as I reached the front porch. I collapsed inside, my hands trembling. The next morning I returned to the woods, but there was no path, no cabin, no sign I had even been there the night before. I checked my watch. It was broken, frozen at 9:14. The townsfolk say Ridgewell has its fair share of strange stories, tales of people going missing only to return with tales they'd rather forget. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, that maybe exhaustion had played tricks on me. But some nights when the wind is just right, I swear I hear a voice whispering in the dark, reminding me that somewhere, in the hidden places of Ridgewell, time waits and watches. I still remember the summer I took a job with an old friend, Lucas, who had recently launched a small documentary project. He aimed to capture authentic paranormal footage for an online series. We both grew up in a quiet New England town, where the houses leaned with age and stories of ghostly sightings were whispered between neighbors. It was this town's history that made it perfect for our endeavor. The centerpiece of our investigation was the infamous Matheson estate, an abandoned mansion at the edge of the woods that had been the subject of many local legends. Built in the late 1800s, it once belonged to a wealthy shipping magnate, William Matheson, who mysteriously disappeared one stormy night. His family followed soon after, vanishing without a trace. The house had been shuttered ever since, its ivy-choked windows like eyes watching anyone who dared to approach. I had my doubts. After all, countless thrill-seekers claimed to hear footsteps or catch glimpses of shadowy figures inside, but no one had produced solid evidence. Lucas, however, was undeterred. This time, we're not just chasing stories, we're capturing them, he said, his eyes alight with excitement. The first night we set up inside the main hall, a grand space now marred by decay and streaks of green mold. We carefully positioned our cameras, each equipped with motion sensors and infrared lenses. The air was damp and cold, even in the summer, and it clung to my skin like a wet shroud. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The wind whispered through the cracks, the old wood creaked, and occasionally, a mouse scurried along the floorboards. We shared stories to pass the time. I kept checking the monitors, half hoping to catch something, half hoping I wouldn't. Then, just after midnight, there was a sound, a faint rustling, almost like the swish of a gown brushing over the floor. Lucas's eyes met mine, the flicker of curiosity shifting to a hardened stare of determination. He gestured to the staircase where we both thought we'd heard it. "Did you get that?" he whispered, pointing at the live feed. I nodded, even though my heartbeat was loud enough to drown out any further sounds. We leaned in, watching the tiny screen in tense silence. There, at the corner of the frame, a pale figure drifted into view. A woman in a tattered dress, her features obscured, hair hanging in tangled sheets over her face. My breath caught in my chest. She glided across the hall before disappearing behind an archway leading to the dining room. For a moment we didn't move. Then, Lucas grabbed his flashlight and motioned for us to follow. "We have to check it out," he whispered, excitement and fear blending in his voice. I hesitated, every instinct screaming for me to stay put, but I wasn't about to let him go alone. The hallway felt longer than it should have, every step stretching time like taffy. The silence became a living thing, pressing in on my ears. We reached the dining room, its dusty table set with decaying plates and candlesticks covered in webs. The temperature dropped sharply, sending a shiver down my spine. We panned our lights around the room, but there was no sign of anyone. "Over here," Lucas said, his voice barely audible. He pointed at one of the chairs. It was pulled back slightly, as if someone had just been sitting there. I reached out, feeling a sudden chill seeping into my hand, colder than the air around us. A quiet gasp escaped my lips as I jerked my fingers back. Then, from the shadows, we heard a low hum, almost melodic. It wrapped around us, distant yet close, like a memory. "Who's there?" Lucas called, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound steady. The hum stopped, and silence returned with a vengeance. We exchanged wide-eyed glances, and for a moment, I thought we'd lost whatever specter we'd disturbed. Then, the light from Lucas's flashlight flickered. Once, twice, and then died completely. The darkness that followed felt absolute, suffocating. Panicking, I switched on the light of my camera. It cast a harsh beam across the room and landed on something that made my heart lurch. A shadow, impossibly tall, standing near the window. Its form was human but stretched, with arms that reached the floor and fingers like branches. "Get out," a voice whispered, close to my ear. Yet when I spun around, there was no one there. The shadow moved, slipping along the wall with impossible fluidity, disappearing as my flashlight flickered back to life. Lucas's voice broke the silence, low and shaken. "We need to go. Now." We didn't wait. We stumbled out, tripping over broken tiles and racing down the hall, the sound of our footsteps thundering like a stampede. Just as we reached the main entrance, I turned back one last time. Through the dim light, I caught sight of the woman again, standing at the top of the staircase. This time, her face was visible. It was pale and gaunt, her eyes deep, hollow voids that seemed to watch us with a mixture of sadness and warning. The door groaned open, and we burst out into the cool, safe embrace of the night. Only when we reached the car did we finally breathe, gulping in air like it was the sweetest thing on earth. We played back the footage the next day. Most of it was as I remembered, shadows moving, the faint hum, but one part stood out. In the dining room, when the chair shifted, a voice faintly whispered, "Leave them in peace." I don't know who they were or what kept them trapped in that decaying mansion, but one thing was clear: they weren't looking for company. It started when my Aunt Marion passed away last winter, leaving behind her cluttered Victorian home at the edge of a sleepy town. It was the kind of place that looked grand in its day but now sagged with years of forgotten stories. I was her only close relative, so it fell to me to sort through the lifetime of trinkets and memories she left behind. It wasn't until the third day of rummaging through dust-laden boxes and stacks of faded photos that I came across it. The doll. I found her in a wooden chest, cradled in yellowing lace and surrounded by old letters. Her porcelain face was finely detailed, with glassy eyes that seemed to watch my every move. Auburn curls framed her face, and she wore a maroon velvet dress that still clung to the faint scent of lavender. I could almost hear my aunt's voice, recalling childhood tales about collecting curiosities. The doll was beautiful but unsettling. As I lifted it out, a chill ran down my spine as though the room had dipped in temperature. Shaking off the feeling, I placed the doll on a chair in the corner and resumed packing. "Silly," I muttered. Yet, from the corner of my eye, the doll's eyes glimmered under the dim afternoon light. Over the next few days, the doll became just another object in the sea of Marion's antiques. That was, until the whispers started. It was late one evening, around the time the sky turned a deep indigo, and I was halfway through boxing up her old china when I heard it. A soft, breathy murmur. I paused, ears straining. Nothing. "Get it together, Lila," I whispered to myself. But the quiet was heavy, pressing against my skin like damp wool. I glanced at the doll, now sitting upright on the chair, perfectly still, eyes fixed in their painted gaze. My heart thudded as I swore the corners of her mouth had tilted into a smirk. Logic told me it was a trick of the light, a remnant of exhaustion. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that those glass eyes followed me as I left the room. The next night, the strange occurrences became undeniable. A soft thud woke me in the early hours, and I lay still, listening. The floorboards creaked as though someone or something was pacing. I reached for my phone, using its dim glow to scan the dark room. Everything was in its place. Everything except the doll. It sat at the foot of my bed. A breath caught in my throat as fear crackled through my veins. I stared, unable to look away. The doll's head tilted ever so slightly, and I could almost hear a faint childlike giggle in the stillness. I wanted to move, scream, anything, but I was paralyzed. "Stop it, it's not real," I finally whispered, my voice breaking the silence. My shaking hands reached out and grabbed the doll, its porcelain cold against my skin. I threw it back into the chest, slamming the lid shut. The sound reverberated through the room, and I felt foolishly reassured. It was just a doll, an old, inanimate object. The rest of the night passed in fitful sleep, broken by fleeting dreams of glassy eyes and tiny cold hands reaching for me. By morning, logic once again smoothed over the night's terror. But as I poured my coffee and glanced at the chair, dread coiled in my gut. The doll was back, perched neatly as if it had never moved. I called a friend, Rachel, who had a penchant for all things odd and vintage. "You need to come over. It's about Marion's doll," I told her, trying to sound casual and failing. Rachel arrived that afternoon, eyes lighting up at the sight of the antique. "Oh wow, Lila, this is gorgeous. You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore." Her fingers traced the delicate stitching on the doll's dress. "It's so lifelike," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "That's what worries me." Her brows knitted together, but she only laughed. "It's just a doll. You're tired. This place can do that to you. It's heavy." Despite Rachel's reassurances, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. Over the following days, the whispers became more distinct, forming fragmented words. "Come play. Don't leave." The doll would shift, appearing in different rooms, always facing me as if waiting for a response. One night, as I sat at my desk trying to distract myself with old photos, I felt a pressure at the back of my neck, as if someone was leaning over me. The tiny voice whispered, "Stay." I spun around, heart slamming in my chest, to see the doll propped on the desk, mere inches from my face. Its eyes seemed deeper, darker, almost alive. I screamed, stumbling backward and knocking a lamp to the floor. That was it. I wasn't going to stay another moment. I stuffed the doll into the chest, locked it, and shoved it into the darkest corner of the attic. I didn't care if it was heirloom or valuable. I needed it gone. For the first time in weeks, the house fell silent. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, warming the old wood floors. I felt the tension in my chest ease, the absurdity of my fear melting in the brightness. Yet as I took a sip of my coffee, a chill crept up my spine. On the table in front of me sat the doll, its porcelain face cracked, and an unfamiliar voice, one that didn't sound like my aunt's, echoed in my mind. "You promised not to leave." The doll's eyes seemed to twinkle, and I knew then that I'd never truly be alone again. I've always considered myself a practical person, the kind who dismisses local legends as the byproducts of boredom and too much imagination. Growing up in Blue Hollow, a small forest-clad town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, You heard every tale from skinwalkers to shadowy, antlered beasts stalking the woods. Most kids couldn't get enough of them. I, however, was more interested in what could be explained by reason. That is, until the night I stayed at my friend Mark's family cabin, something that still creeps into my dreams, leaving me wide-eyed in the dark. It was late October when Mark convinced me and two of our other friends, Lena and Chris, to spend the weekend up at his family's old hunting cabin. The cabin, he said with a smirk, was where legends are born. He loved to fuel our conversations with ghost stories or whispered tales of cryptids that had supposedly roamed these woods for centuries. I rolled my eyes when he told us about the Watcher, a shadowy figure said to resemble an impossibly tall human with eyes that glowed an unsettling amber in the moonlight. "You sure you're not just trying to scare us?" Lena teased, her voice half joking as we drove the winding dirt road up to the cabin, the dense trees closing in around us. "Maybe I am," Mark replied, a grin splitting his face in the dim dashboard light. But even as we laughed, there was something in the air, a kind of silence that seemed heavier than usual. I brushed it off as the chill of autumn and the whispers of leaves in the breeze. The cabin was exactly as I'd expected, a one-story structure with a front porch that groaned under our weight, its wooden boards bowed from years of use. The scent of pine resin and the dry, cold bite of the mountain air made it feel both peaceful and a touch eerie. Inside, the cabin held the scent of old timber, tinged with the musk of forgotten seasons. By the time we settled in, the sun had long dipped behind the tree line, casting the forest into deep shadow. We sat around the wood-burning stove, its warm light flickering over our faces as Mark, predictably, brought up the story of the Watcher again. "People say you only see it if you're out after midnight," Mark said, leaning forward with a theatrical whisper. "It watches you first, learning how you move, what makes you afraid." "Nice try, Mark," Chris interrupted, though he shifted in his chair with an uncomfortable chuckle. "Look, if we're really going to test this," Lena said, glancing at the old clock on the mantel, "we've got time for a hike before midnight." Her suggestion was met with silence, but she pushed us with her confident smile. "Come on, we're here to do something memorable, right?" The night air was sharp when we stepped outside, breath forming in little clouds as we wandered into the woods with flashlights that barely pierced the darkness. The wind carried the dry rustle of leaves, punctuated by the occasional hoot of an owl or the snapping of twigs underfoot. "Tell me this," Chris said, trying to keep his tone light. "If the Watcher is so scary, how come no one's ever caught it on camera?" Mark didn't miss a beat. "Maybe it doesn't let you get close enough. Or maybe the people who see it don't live to tell anyone about it." A branch cracked somewhere to our left, and Lena's flashlight beam flicked across the gnarled tree trunks, casting strange, twisting shadows. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but I forced a smile. "Deer, maybe," I said, more for myself than the others. But then we heard it, a low, rhythmic noise, like something large breathing or exhaling from deep within the forest. The group fell silent, exchanging uneasy glances. My skin prickled as I swept my flashlight across the underbrush. It caught nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched tightened around us like a noose. "I think we should head back," Lena whispered, her voice strained in a way that suggested she wasn't looking for an argument. We all nodded, grateful for the suggestion. As we turned, Chris suddenly froze, his light illuminating a pair of eyes reflecting back at us from just beyond the tree line. They were amber, eerily steady, unblinking. They seemed to float higher than any animal I could name, taller than a man but moving fluidly, as if attached to a shadow that wove itself between the trunks. "Run," I said before I could stop myself. We sprinted, the cold night air biting at our faces, lungs burning with each gasp. I dared not look back, but I could hear the dry leaves shifting behind us, a relentless, quiet pursuit. We stumbled back onto the cabin's porch, slamming the door behind us as Mark shoved an old chair under the doorknob. Panting, we exchanged wide-eyed looks, listening for movement outside. The silence stretched on, taut and stifling. "Did you see that?" Chris finally broke the quiet, his voice shaking. We all nodded. unable to find words. The rest of the night passed without sleep, every creak of the old cabin causing us to tense up. By morning, the sun pierced the thin curtains, bathing the room in an almost mocking warmth. When we stepped outside, the dew-soaked grass and misted forest looked ordinary again, familiar. But as I glanced down, my breath caught in my throat. Just outside the door were massive, deep impressions in the soft earth, elongated like human footprints, but too large to be anything human. The Watcher, it seemed, wasn't just a story after all. I never considered myself particularly superstitious. Growing up in the small town of Briar Hollow, tales of the supernatural were just stories passed around during bonfires or whispered about in the hushed corners of our local library. It wasn't until I moved back into my grandfather's old house nestled at the edge of the forest that I discovered some legends had roots deeper than mere folklore. The house itself was a relic of a bygone era, all creaking wooden floors and heavy dust-laden curtains. I had inherited it after my grandfather passed, an enigmatic man with a collection of books that seemed older than time itself. One evening, after a day of unpacking, I stumbled upon a small leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of faded encyclopedias. Its spine was cracked, the pages yellowed and frail. Curiosity pulled me in as I skimmed through the entries. They were written in my grandfather's meticulous handwriting, but instead of mundane notes, they chronicled stories of rituals performed in Briar Hollow decades ago. Rituals that promised glimpses beyond the veil of the living world. Some were harmless enough, mere rites of passage for thrill seekers, but one, detailed on a page marred with a dark, unidentifiable stain, bore a warning in thick, uneven strokes. Do not attempt under any circumstances. A shiver pricked the back of my neck as I read the title, The Midnight Offering. That evening, my friend Sam stopped by. He had always been the adventurous type, drawn to mysteries the way moths are drawn to flame. "You're telling me your grandfather kept this hidden?" "We have to try it," he said, eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and mischief. I hesitated, my gut churning. "It feels off, Sam. The way it's written, it's almost like he was afraid of it." Sam waved a hand dismissively. "Come on, Jake, it's just a ritual. We do it, get a good laugh, and call it a night." Despite my better judgment, I agreed. We set the date for the following night. The air was thick with anticipation when the time came. We gathered in my grandfather's old study, the room dimly lit by a single oil lamp. The instructions were simple but unsettling. We needed a mirror, a candle, and a personal token, something that held significance to the person performing the ritual. Sam brought a locket that had belonged to his mother, and I, after a moment's hesitation, chose my grandfather's old pocket watch. We chanted the incantation, our voices low and wavering. The candle's flame flickered wildly, as if it were trying to resist an unseen wind. A sudden chill swept through the room, and my reflection in the mirror seemed off. The eyes staring back at me held a depth I'd never seen before, as if another consciousness had taken hold. "Jake, are you seeing this?" Sam's voice cracked, his bravado slipping. I glanced over and saw his reflection moving independently of him, tilting its head with an expression of hollow curiosity. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the room like the tolling of a faraway bell. The mirror's surface shimmered and darkened, revealing a shifting landscape that felt both foreign and familiar. Before we could react, a whisper, sharp and urgent, filled my mind. "Stop. You don't know what you've summoned." My heart pounded as the room seemed to close in on us, shadows bleeding into each other until the world outside the mirror felt more real than our own. Sam gasped, eyes wide with horror as a figure appeared behind his reflection, tall and indistinct, with hollow eyes that bore into my soul. "We have to end this," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. But Sam was frozen, his gaze locked with whatever presence had joined us. I reached for his arm, shaking him desperately. The moment my fingers touched his skin, a force like an electric shock knocked us both backward. The mirror shattered. fragments scattering across the floor, each shard reflecting those hollow, haunting eyes before going dark. The silence that followed was deafening. We sat there, breathing heavily, surrounded by the cold remnants of something ancient and malignant. The locket lay cracked on the floor, and the pocket watch's hands spun wildly before stopping at midnight. Neither of us spoke as we picked ourselves up, shaken to our cores. To this day, we don't talk about what we saw. We moved out of the house shortly after, but every now and then, when I glance at a mirror, I swear I catch the faintest flicker of movement in my reflection, as if something is still watching, waiting. I never thought that my summer in the Hudson Valley would lead to an experience so chilling. I'd find myself waking up years later, still shivering at the memory. It all started when I was invited to a small, exclusive gathering at an old stone manor just outside Rhinebeck. The property had been rented by a friend, a famous actor whose name most people would recognize in an instant. Let's call him Aaron, to keep things private. The manor was grand, almost ancient, with ivy snaking up its gray walls and tall windows that caught the moonlight in eerie patches. Inside, antique furniture, creaking floors, and the faint smell of books and age filled the rooms. It was perfect for Aaron, who'd always had a love for the peculiar and dramatic. On the second night, after a late dinner full of stories and laughter, we found ourselves gathered in the parlor. The evening's playful conversations had begun shifting into whispers, as if the walls themselves were listening. Someone mentioned the manor's history, how it was once owned by a reclusive poet who vanished without a trace. This sparked Aaron's eyes with mischief. "I heard," Aaron said, leaning forward with a grin that masked a genuine intensity, "that she wrote her last poem in this very room, and that her spirit still walks these halls." A silence fell over us. The room seemed to shrink as shadows deepened around the flickering light of the single oil lamp. "Let's not do this," another guest, Lydia, muttered. She was a singer known for her radiant voice, now wavering with unease. "This place already feels heavy." "Oh, come on," Aaron said, waving a dismissive hand. "We're in the business of telling stories, aren't we? What's a ghost tale if not the essence of drama?" I chuckled nervously, but I couldn't shake the cold prickle on my neck. That's when Aaron proposed the seance. "Just a game," he said with a playful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "If there's a story here, we'll find it." We sat in a circle, the lamp dimmed so low that the faces around me became ghostly outlines. Aaron's confident voice started the session, asking simple questions to an empty room. "If you're here, give us a sign," he intoned, and the only answer was silence. The air felt charged, as if the very house held its breath. "See? Nothing," Lydia whispered, half laughing. Then a draft swept across the room. The curtains, though closed tight, shivered as if touched by invisible hands. My pulse quickened, and Aaron's smile faltered. The temperature dropped, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and stays. Before anyone could speak, there was a knock, a single sharp knock on the parlor door. We stared at it, unmoving, the room held by a silence so dense that even the fire's crackling seemed distant. "Aaron, stop this," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "I didn't do that." Aaron replied, his bravado gone. A shiver passed down my spine. I wanted to speak, to suggest ending this ridiculous game, but my mouth felt glued shut. Then, the knock came again, louder this time, and then, as if moved by a gust, the door creaked open just an inch. Beyond it, there was nothing but darkness. I glanced at Aaron. His confident mask had cracked, revealing wide eyes filled with something close to fear. For a heartbeat, we sat paralyzed. Then Lydia jumped up, breaking the spell. The moment she did, the room seemed to sigh, the oppressive silence lifting like a blanket pulled away. "It's just the wind," someone said, but their voice was thin, unconvincing. We dispersed soon after, each pretending the night's strangeness was only nerves and tricks of the mind. But deep down, we knew better. I lay in my room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of that knock, the door opening, the chill that seemed to carry more than just air. The next morning, I found Aaron outside on the terrace, staring at the distant woods. He was pale, his usual easy charm gone. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He glanced at me, then back at the woods. "Did you hear anything after you went to bed?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Nothing but the wind." I paused. "Did you?" He nodded, looking haunted. "A knock, but it was at my door this time. I thought it was one of you messing around, but when I checked, no one was there. I swear I heard a woman's voice low, whispering something I couldn't understand." I swallowed hard, the weight of his confession pressing on my chest. We didn't talk about it again, and neither did anyone else at the house. But as I left the manor that afternoon, I glanced back at the window of the parlor. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale face peering out, eyes as dark as ink watching us leave. The story ended there for us, but the whispers about the manor didn't. Months later, I read an article that an old notebook belonging to the missing poet had been found in that house. The last poem scribbled inside read, "When the living disturb the quiet, I knock to remind them of shadows." It's a memory I've carried ever since, a reminder that sometimes the most famous faces hide the darkest encounters. It was in the early autumn of 2005 when I moved into a modest house on the outskirts of a quiet town in Pennsylvania. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and the most scandalous thing to happen was a cat wandering too far from its porch. I was taking a break from the fast-paced city life, opting for a career as a freelance writer. The house, with its creaking floorboards and ivy-draped walls, came at a bargain price, though its history had raised eyebrows. Locals called it the Reynard House, named after Marcus Reynard, who vanished from it 50 years prior without a trace. He was a known recluse, a retired watchmaker with an obsession for perfecting old grandfather clocks. His sudden disappearance had been the talk of the town for years, surrounded by whispers of foul play, though no evidence ever surfaced. The mystery had hardened into legend, and most folks avoided the place out of an unspoken superstition. But I was too practical for ghost stories, or so I thought. The first few days passed in peaceful quietness, broken only by the distant sound of cars rolling by, or the rustle of the trees. But soon, I began to notice things. It started with the clock in the hallway, an old towering piece with brass pendulums. I hadn't wound it, nor did I think it could still work. Yet one night, I heard it ticking, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the wooden halls. I told myself it was an old mechanism stuck, or maybe an effect of settling wood. Yet every time I passed it, I felt a prickle run up my spine. The tick-tock seemed louder at night, almost like a heartbeat. It kept me up more nights than I cared to admit. Then came the whispers. It started as faint murmurs that I thought were just the wind slipping through the cracked window panes. But one evening, as I sat in my makeshift study reviewing old case files for an article I was writing, I heard a distinct voice, soft, raspy, as if spoken by someone long unused to speaking. It murmured one word: "Why?" My fingers froze over the keyboard. The air chilled as if an unseen hand had brushed past me. The house settled again into silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I convinced myself I was just tired. After all, the mind plays tricks, especially when you're alone for too long. But soon the whispers became more insistent, trailing through the rooms as I moved. Where is it? Find it? Each night I found myself waking at 2:15 a.m., the exact time Marcus Reynard had reportedly last been seen, according to old newspaper clippings I'd dug up. One night, I decided to confront whatever it was. I sat by the grandfather clock, armed with a flashlight and a sense of foolish bravado. The clock face glimmered dully under the beam, and I waited, ears straining against the creaks of the house. Then it happened. A sound like soft scratching came from behind the clock. My breath hitched as I reached for the wooden side panel. which to my surprise popped open easily. Inside there was a narrow, hollow compartment, and at its base, an aged, leather-bound journal. The initials MR were scrawled on the cover. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. The entries were frantic, filled with notes on time experiments, distorted time loops, and entries that descended into near gibberish. It's watching. It knows. The pendulum holds more than time. Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped, and I felt an icy pressure grip my arm. I turned sharply, expecting to see an intruder, but the room was empty. Yet, in the reflection of the clock's glass, I saw a shadow, a tall figure, hunched and wearing a brimmed hat, its eyes glinting red like embers. "Why?" the voice rasped, clear and near, but from nowhere I could place. I stumbled back, the journal clutched to my chest, and the figure faded from the glass as quickly as it appeared. Over the next few days, I pieced together that Marcus Reynard had believed he could slow down time itself, possibly to cheat death. He must have triggered something that sealed him between moments, caught in an endless loop at 2:15 a.m. The whispers persisted, and the shadow would watch me from the corners, never closer, but enough to remind me it was there. One night, as the ticking grew deafening, I decided to smash the clock. The wood splintered under the weight of my hammer, and the pendulum snapped, clattering to the ground. The air seemed to sigh with relief, and for the first time, the house was silent. I thought I had banished whatever haunted it, but at 2:15 a.m., I woke to find the journal open at my bedside, an entry written in fresh ink. The clock breaks, but time remains. It is waiting, and so it does. I wasn't always one to believe in ghosts. To be honest, I used to laugh at the idea, thinking it was all just people's imaginations running wild, or stories meant to get attention. But when I moved to the small town of Sable Creek, everything changed. It wasn't the people or the weather or even the old creaky house I rented on the outskirts of town. It was something else, something I couldn't explain, something that followed me through every hallway and whispered to me in the dead of night. The house had a reputation, sure. It was the oldest in town, built in the 1800s, and rumored to be haunted by a family who had disappeared mysteriously long ago. But that was just gossip. People loved a good story, especially in a place where not much ever happened. Still, there was something unnerving about the way the house sat on the edge of town, surrounded by nothing but dense woods and an eerie silence that stretched for miles. When I moved in, I wasn't thinking much of it. The rent was cheap, and the house itself was charming in its own way, except for the strange, narrow hallway that led to the attic, which I could never quite bring myself to go into. At first, I chalked up my unease to the building's age, the way the floors creaked, the way the wind seemed to howl through the cracks in the windows at night. But things started happening. Little things at first. The front door would be wide open in the morning, even though I knew I'd locked it the night before. Footsteps in the hallway when I was alone in the house. And sometimes I'd hear a soft, low murmur, almost like a conversation, coming from upstairs when no one was there. I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind playing tricks with my mind. But that didn't explain the feeling of being watched, the cold spots that would appear in random places, or the way the shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't deny it either. Then one night, something happened that changed everything. It was late, past midnight, and I had just finished reading a book in the living room. I stood up to go to bed, but as I passed the hallway, I saw something. A shadow. It wasn't a person, but it was there, moving just out of my peripheral vision. I froze, staring at the empty space. It didn't make sense. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and I knew no one else was in the house. The shadow didn't have any distinct shape, just a dark mass that seemed to swirl, like smoke caught in the light. I should have run, I should have screamed. But instead I did something I still can't quite explain. I walked toward it. My feet felt like they were moving on their own, almost as if something was pulling me closer. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the shadow, everything went silent. The air grew still, too still, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. "Leave." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but the words were clear. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. An old photograph framed on the wall beside the door. I hadn't noticed it before. It was a black and white picture of a family, standing outside what looked like a smaller version of my house. There was a man, a woman, and 2 children, their faces solemn, their eyes almost lifeless. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the next day I went into town and asked around about the house. Everyone had heard the stories, of course, but no one could give me anything solid, except for Mrs. Carr, the town's oldest resident. She had a reputation for knowing everything about Sable Creek's history, and when I mentioned the picture, her face went pale. Ah, yes, that family, the Danvers. They vanished in the early 1900s, she said, her voice trembling slightly. No one ever found out what happened to them. Some say they left town, but others believe something far darker happened. I asked her what she meant by darker, but she clammed up and wouldn't say another word on the matter. That night, I returned to the house, my mind buzzing with questions. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it again. The weight of being watched, the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. The shadows grew darker, the whispers louder. It wasn't just me anymore. I could see them, hear them. The family in the photograph, they were real, and they were angry. I started to feel their presence more and more, especially at night, when I'd lie awake in bed, listening to the floorboards creak above me, hearing the soft padding of footsteps walking just outside my room. I don't know when it started, but I began having strange dreams. Dreams where I would wake up in the middle of the night, only to find the house empty and cold, the windows shattered, and the walls covered in dark, almost smeared handprints. I would wander through the halls looking for something or someone, but no matter how hard I searched, I could never find anyone, until I reached the attic. The attic door was always locked, but I started hearing scratching sounds from inside. At first I thought it was just rats or the house settling, but after a while, it became clear that whatever was in there was trying to get out. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but the more I did, the worse it became. The scratching turned into banging, loud, desperate banging that rattled the entire house. That's when I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I called a local historian, a man named Jack, who specialized in the paranormal. He agreed to meet me at the house, saying he had heard rumors about the Danvers family and their connection to something dark. When he arrived, he immediately started to set up his equipment. EVP recorders, motion detectors, and a strange device that he said could detect changes in energy fields. We spent hours in the house, listening to the sounds, the whispers, the footsteps that weren't ours. But what really got to me was the feeling in the attic. Jack's face turned pale when we reached the top of the stairs. He looked at me with wide eyes and whispered, "You should have left when you had the chance." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and fled down the stairs, leaving me alone. I stood there, frozen, hearing a voice whisper my name from the darkness above. I ran after him, but by the time I reached the front door, Jack was gone. His car was still parked outside, but there was no sign of him. He had simply disappeared. I never saw him again. After that night, I left Sable Creek, leaving the house and the ghosts behind. The town went on, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded in that old building. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, still watching, still waiting. Years later, I heard the news, a string of unsolved murders in the town, all occurring near that same house. The victims were killed in strange, almost ritualistic ways, their faces frozen in terror, their bodies found in places that didn't make sense. It was as if they had been led there by some unseen force. I don't know if the murders were connected to the house, but part of me wonders if they were. Maybe the Danvers family never left. Maybe they had been waiting for someone like me to find them, to awaken them from the shadows. And maybe, just maybe, they got what they were looking for. I'd never believed in ghosts, not really. Growing up in a small town in the Midwest, there wasn't much that could convince me otherwise. I'd heard the stories, of course, the local legends, the whispers of hauntings in old buildings or on long-forgotten roads. But those were always just stories. That was until I was stationed at a military base on the outskirts of a quiet, forgotten town. The base was old, built in the 1940s, back when the world was a little darker, a little colder. There was a certain heaviness to the place, something you couldn't quite place, like it had absorbed too much history. I was a young soldier, just a year into my service, when I was assigned to a remote part of the base, an area known as Area 12. Most of the personnel who worked there were older, experienced soldiers who had been there for years. They spoke of the area with an unsettling reverence, but never with specifics. There were rumors of strange things happening in that part of the base. Footsteps in the empty halls, lights flickering at odd hours, and a chill that couldn't be explained. But of course I was skeptical. I remember the first night I worked late. It was one of those nights where the moon seemed to hang too low in the sky, casting everything in an eerie silver glow. The sound of the wind outside rattled the windows, but inside there was an unnatural silence. I was working late, catching up on some reports, and the rest of the base had emptied out hours ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, but everything else was still. I was just starting to finish up when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside. At first, I thought it was one of the others. Maybe someone had stayed late as well. But the footsteps weren't hurried. They were slow, deliberate. I got up to check, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Just empty, cold air and the hum of the lights. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I returned to my desk, but the air felt heavier now. The room seemed darker, even though the lights were still on. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind. But the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was around 2 a.m. when the power cut out. Total darkness, just like that. I froze, listening to the hum of the generator kicking in, but the silence in the hallway was unnerving. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the walls, the old office equipment scattered around the room. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were closer. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The footsteps were slow but steady, as though something was walking toward me. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the others. But as I stood up, the door slammed shut, startling me. That was the moment I should have run. Instead, I stood frozen, staring at the door. There was no logical explanation for it. The air was thick with the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A low murmur, like voices carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, urgent, desperate, pleading. I couldn't understand why, but I knew I had to leave. I don't know if it was instinct or something else, but I grabbed my gear and bolted from the office. As I moved through the hallways, I could feel the temperature drop, the air turning to ice. It was as if the base itself was pushing me out, urging me to leave. When I finally reached the exit, I thought I'd be free of whatever had been haunting me. But as I turned the corner, I saw him. A figure, standing in the shadows just outside the building. His uniform was old, worn, like something from a different era. His face was obscured by a shadow, but I could tell he was staring directly at me. My heart stopped for a moment. "Hey!" I called, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" But the figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. A cold chill ran down my spine. That's when I heard it. A voice, close to my ear, soft but clear. "Get out!" I spun around, but there was no one behind me. The figure was gone, just gone. I didn't sleep that night. In fact, I didn't sleep for several nights after that. Something about that base was off. Every corner felt watched, every hallway too quiet. I started to hear more strange noises, doors creaking when no one was there. whispers in the hallways, cold spots that would appear out of nowhere. I spoke to some of the older soldiers about it, trying to brush it off as paranoia. But every single one of them had stories about things they'd seen, heard, or felt. One older man, Sergeant Harris, shared his experience with me. "You think you're the first one to notice?" he said, his voice low and serious. "That base has history. People died there, soldiers, civilians. It's been used for more than just training." I didn't press him for details, but he continued. "Some of them never left." There were other incidents, strange things that seemed to be happening more frequently. A colleague of mine, Private Lopez, started seeing shadows in the corner of his eyes. He swore that someone was walking with him through the halls, but when he turned to look, no one was there. At first I dismissed it as fatigue, the stress of being on a military base, but then I started hearing about similar experiences from others, and it was getting worse. More soldiers were reporting strange encounters. Objects moved from one place to another, lights that would flicker at exactly 3 a.m., and unexplained noises. It felt like the base was alive, like it was holding on to something, some piece of its history that it didn't want to let go. But the worst part was the feeling that something was watching, waiting, just out of sight. I'd feel it in the showers, in the mess hall, even in the barracks at night. Every time I turned around, it felt like something was there, just behind me, breathing down my neck. Then, one night, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was on patrol, walking through the back area of the base near the old warehouses. The wind howled through the empty yard, carrying with it the scent of metal and dust. I was alone, as usual, just doing my rounds. When I reached the old storage building, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to let in the breeze. I knew I should have checked it out, but something stopped me. I looked around, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw the figure again, the one I'd seen outside. But when I blinked, he was gone. I walked toward the building, my flashlight cutting through the dark, and that's when I heard it. A voice, soft but clear, from inside the building. "Help me." I froze. The voice was human, desperate, and filled with a kind of sorrow that made my stomach turn. My heart raced in my chest. There was no one there, no one but me. I hesitated, the rational part of my mind screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. I had to see. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick, damp, as if the room had been sealed for years. And then I saw it. The figure. But this time, it wasn't just a soldier. It was a man, bloodied, his uniform torn and stained. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he reached out toward me with trembling hands. "Help me," he whispered again, the words barely audible. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. My mind was racing. What was I seeing? Was it a trick of the light? A hallucination? But the man reached out again, his voice echoing in the dark. "Help me." And that was when I understood. This wasn't just some old military base. It was a place where people had suffered, had died, and had never truly left. The voices, the figures, it was their way of reaching out, of trying to make us see. I ran out of there faster than I've ever run in my life. The door slammed shut behind me, and the feeling of being watched never left. The next day, I requested a transfer. I couldn't stay there any longer. Something about the place had gotten under my skin, and no matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, I couldn't. I don't know if it was the ghost of the soldier or the countless others who had died there, but I knew I had to leave before it consumed me. I don't know if it's the same for everyone who gets stationed at that base, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by eyes that weren't there. Eyes that had seen too much, and had been trapped in the walls long after their owners were gone. And to this day, I can't shake the sound of that voice. It still haunts me, lingering in the back of my mind, whispering in the dead of night. "Help me." The year I decided to take a break from teaching, I found myself drawn to a remote coastal town named Brackenridge. Nestled between jagged cliffs and shrouded in a perpetual mist, the town was a place where time felt suspended, a forgotten chapter in a well-worn book. Brackenridge was known for its foggy mornings, the scent of salt and pine in the air, and a history entwined with the sea's tragedies. I rented a room in an old Victorian house at the end of Harbor Street. It was an imposing structure with tall, narrow windows that gazed out over the Atlantic, as if keeping vigil for a ship that would never return. The landlady, Mrs. Abernathy, was a sprightly woman in her 80s, with eyes as sharp as the winter wind. When I first arrived, she handed me the key, a heavy brass thing that seemed older than the house itself. Her eyes lingered on me with an intensity that made me pause. "Many have stayed in that room," she said, almost in passing. "Not all have seen what you might see." A nervous chuckle escaped me, but she didn't smile. Instead, she turned and shuffled away, leaving me with only the creaking of the floorboards and the distant crash of waves. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door to my new home. The room was modest, yet cozy. A 4-poster bed with a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs took up most of the space. A small writing desk sat by the window, and an antique oil lamp stood on the table, its brass base tarnished by time. But what drew my attention immediately was a large painting on the far wall. It depicted the RMS Titanic in all her glory, gliding through a serene sea under a star-studded sky. The painting was so detailed that it seemed to capture the life on deck. Tiny figures frozen in time, their faces blurred yet strangely haunting. I shook off the odd feeling that crept over me and set about unpacking. That night, the wind howled around the house, rattling the window panes like an impatient guest. I sat in bed reading by the soft glow of the oil lamp when I first heard it. A soft, rhythmic knock at the door. I glanced up, the hair on my arm standing on end. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Hello?" My voice cracked, the silence that followed suffocating. When no answer came, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It had to be the wind, I reasoned. This old house probably amplified every sound. But then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard a faint tune, a lilting, mournful song that made my chest tighten. It drifted on the edge of hearing, so fragile that I wondered if I'd imagined it. I waited, listening, but it faded as quickly as it came. The next morning, I asked Mrs. Abernathy about the history of the house while she polished a set of brass candlesticks. She paused, her cloth hovering mid-air. "This house has seen many things," she said, eyes narrowing as if she were weighing her words. "Back in 1912, after the Titanic sank, there was a survivor who came here. He rented that very room. Captain Elijah Moore, a man who claimed he heard the voices of those who perished. He wrote in his journal that they followed him, that they wanted him to remember." "Do you believe that?" I asked, half smiling, trying to mask the chill that had settled over me. "I believe the sea never forgets," she replied simply. That evening, rain pelted the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. I sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance and cast long, flickering shadows. The painting seemed to draw my gaze. The figures on the deck appeared more distinct, as if they had shifted subtly in the dim light. My eyes locked on a woman with long hair, her outline blurred, one hand raised as if reaching out. I blinked hard, shaking off the creeping unease. A sudden knock jolted me out of my thoughts. This time it was louder, more insistent. I stood, heart hammering, and approached the door. My fingers brushed the cold brass knob, but something made me pause. Instead, I pressed my ear to the wood. The knocking stopped, replaced by that same ghostly song. It was clearer now, a melody full of sorrow and longing, layered with voices that spoke in a language I couldn't understand. I backed away, my breath shallow and ragged. "Remember us," a whisper drifted through the room, so close it felt like a cold breath on my neck. I spun around, the room empty except for the painting. The woman's face was now unmistakably turned toward me, her eyes hollow and mournful. Panic surged in my chest as the walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with the scent of seawater. I stumbled to the window and threw it open, gasping for the salty, rain-soaked air. Below, the waves crashed violently against the rocks, their roar almost drowning out the whispering voices that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the chair by the window, the painting looming behind me like a silent witness. By dawn, the whispers had faded, replaced by the distant cry of seagulls and the gentle lapping of the tide. The next day, I met Thomas, a local historian who spent his mornings at the cafe near the harbor. He was an older man with a face weathered by years of sea spray and sun, eyes sharp and observant. When I mentioned Captain Moore, his expression darkened. "Ah, so you've heard about him," Thomas said, setting down his cup. Moore was convinced he brought something back with him from that night. They say he spent the rest of his days chasing away the voices, but in the end they took him. "Took him?" I asked, the room seeming to grow colder. "They found him in that very room, staring out at the sea, eyes wide open but unseeing. They say his face was serene, like he'd joined them." The wind picked up as I left the cafe, the day turning gray and ominous. Back in the room, I stared at the painting. The woman's figure was gone, leaving only empty railings and shadowed shapes. I searched the canvas, my fingers grazing the cracked paint, and felt an inexplicable tug of grief, as if mourning something long lost. The knock came again that night, louder than before. This time it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps outside the door. They paced back and forth, the floorboards creaking under their weight. I held my breath as the song returned, louder, more anguished, filling the room with a suffocating heaviness. I backed away, my heart racing, and the door creaked open on its own. The hallway beyond was dark, but the air was thick with the scent of the sea, sharp and cold. A shadow moved, barely discernible but unmistakably there. A whisper followed. "Remember us." I stumbled backward, the cold seeping into my bones. The figure stepped into the room, a woman, her eyes hollow and filled with a sorrow so profound it made my knees buckle. She raised her hand, fingers pale and dripping with seawater, and pointed to the painting. My vision blurred, and suddenly I was no longer in the room. I stood on the deck of the Titanic, the air freezing and thick with screams and panic. The sea stretched out, dark and unforgiving, as figures rushed past me, their faces pale and desperate. The woman stood at the edge, her eyes locked with mine as the ship's bow dipped into the icy depths. "Remember us," she whispered, her voice a breath that carried across the chaos. The ship tilted, and I felt the cold bite of the Atlantic surge up to claim me. I gasped, the room snapping back into focus as I collapsed to the floor, soaked in sweat and trembling. The storm outside had stilled, the first rays of dawn piercing through the clouds. The painting was shattered on the floor, the figures gone, leaving only an empty, silent sea. Mrs. Abernathy found me packing that morning. She didn't ask, only watched with a knowing look. "They came, didn't they?" she said, her voice soft. I nodded, unable to find my voice. "They just wanted someone to remember," she whispered. "Now you'll carry them too." And as I left Brackenridge, the whisper of that song stayed with me, a reminder that some stories are not meant to be forgotten. They find their way to those who will keep them alive, like echoes drifting on the tide.